Sarah Chen adjusted her magnifying glass as the afternoon light streamed through the windows of Henderson Estate Appraisals in Newport, Rhode Island. The autumn of 2023 had brought an unusual influx of families liquidating their ancestral collections, and today's appointment promised to be particularly intriguing. Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore, an elegant woman in her 70s, carefully unwrapped a large framed photograph from silk cloth. "This has been in our family for over a century," she explained, her voice carrying the refined accent of old New England money. "It's my great-grandmother's wedding portrait from 1912. Sarah's breath caught as she examined the sepia-toned photograph. The image captured what appeared to be the perfect Gilded Age wedding celebration. In the foreground, a radiant bride in an elaborate lace gown stood beside her dapper groom on the manicured grounds of a magnificent mansion. Behind them, dozens of well-dressed guests smiled at the camera, their faces beaming with joy and prosperity. The Whitmore estate was one of Newport's grandest summer cottages, Dorothy continued, settling into the leather chair across from Sarah's desk. 42 rooms, overlooking the Atlantic. My great-grandmother Margaret married into quite a fortune. Sarah nodded, noting the photograph's remarkable clarity for its age. The details were extraordinary. She could make out individual pearls on the bride's necklace, the intricate beadwork on the guests' gowns, even the carved details of the mansion's elaborate architecture in the background. "It's absolutely stunning," Sarah murmured, beginning her preliminary assessment. "The composition, the lighting, the preservation, this is museum quality." As she moved her magnifying glass across the image, cataloging details for her appraisal report, something caught her attention in the mansion's upper floors. She paused, adjusting the focus, her pulse quickening slightly. In one of the third-floor windows, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the silhouette of a figure. Unlike the joyous celebration below, this person appeared to be pressed against the glass, their posture suggesting something far different from celebration. Sarah glanced up at Dorothy, who was gazing fondly at the photograph, apparently unaware of what her trained eye had just discovered. The appraiser felt that familiar tingle of curiosity that came with uncovering hidden stories in historical artifacts. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I'd like to examine this more closely if you don't mind." Sarah positioned her high-powered digital magnifier over the photograph, her heart racing as the image on her computer screen revealed what the naked eye could barely detect. The figure in the window was definitely human, a woman based on the silhouette, wearing what appeared to be a white dress or nightgown. "Is everything all right, dear?" Dorothy asked, noticing Sarah's intense concentration. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you tell me about the mansion's layout? Specifically what was on the third floor?" Dorothy's expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing across her features. "The third floor. Oh, that was, well, family quarters. Bedrooms, sitting rooms. Nothing particularly interesting." She paused, her fingers fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "Why do you ask?" Sarah angled the screen toward her client. "There appears to be someone in this upper window." "Do you see here?" She pointed to the magnified section. Dorothy leaned forward, squinting at the screen. For a moment her face went completely pale. She sat back abruptly, her hand moving to her chest. I'm not sure what you're referring to." But Sarah was certain she'd seen recognition flash across the older woman's eyes. There was definitely more to this story. "In my experience with historical photographs," Sarah said gently, "details like this often reveal fascinating family stories. Sometimes people were ill and couldn't attend celebrations, or there were family members who preferred privacy." Dorothy remained silent for several long moments, staring at the photograph with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There were complications in our family history, things that weren't discussed openly in those days." She looked up at Sarah with watery eyes. "You have to understand, mental illness was viewed very differently in 1912. Families protected their reputations above all else." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of hidden story that made her work so rewarding. "Would you be comfortable sharing more?" Sometimes understanding the full context actually increases a photograph's historical value. Dorothy glanced around the quiet office as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "There was a woman in our family, Eleanor. She was my great-uncle James's wife. After their first child was stillborn, she was never quite the same. The pieces were beginning to fall into place." Sarah made notes while maintaining eye contact, encouraging Dorothy to continue. Eleanor was kept in the upper floors of the mansion for her own safety, you understand. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she continued her story. Eleanor Whitmore was actually quite accomplished before her marriage to James. She'd attended Vassar College, spoke 3 languages, and was considered one of Newport's most eligible young women. But after losing her baby, Sarah listened intently while simultaneously researching on her tablet. What year did she marry James? 1910, I believe. The baby was born and died in early 1911. By the summer of 1912, when Margaret's wedding took place, Eleanor was... Dorothy struggled for words. She was confined to the 3rd floor for everyone's safety. Sarah's research was already yielding results. Public records showed that Eleanor Whitmore had indeed been declared mentally incompetent by the state of Rhode Island in late 1911. What struck Sarah as particularly tragic was that Eleanor would have been only 23 years old at the time. The family called it a nervous condition. Dorothy continued. In those days, women who suffered what we now know as postpartum depression were often institutionalized, or, if the family was wealthy enough, kept at home under constant supervision. Sarah examined the figure in the window more closely. Now that she knew what she was looking for, she could make out more details. The woman appeared to be wearing a white dress, possibly a nightgown or day dress. Her posture suggested she was leaning against the glass, perhaps trying to see the celebration below. Did Eleanor ever recover? Sarah asked gently. Dorothy's expression grew even more somber. That's where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. According to family letters I found in my grandmother's trunk, Eleanor had moments of complete lucidity. She would write beautiful poetry, paint watercolors, and beg to join the family downstairs. But James and the family doctor believed that excitement or stimulation would worsen her condition. Sarah was taking detailed notes, already envisioning how this story might unfold. So she was watching her sister-in-law's wedding from the window, essentially a prisoner in her own home. Exactly, Dorothy nodded. Can you imagine? A young, intelligent woman trapped upstairs while life continued without her, just floors below. Sarah studied the photograph again, this time seeing it through completely different eyes. What had initially appeared to be a joyous family celebration now revealed itself as something far more complex, a moment of happiness shadowed by hidden tragedy. Mrs. Whitmore, would you be open to me researching this further? Sometimes these stories deserve to be told properly. Dorothy considered this for a long moment. What would that involve? 3 days later, Sarah found herself in the basement archives of the Newport Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of documents dating back to the early 1900s. The musty smell of old paper and leather filled her nostrils as she carefully handled century-old correspondence and medical records. Her research had already revealed disturbing details about Eleanor's treatment. A folder marked Whitmore Family, Private Correspondence, contained letters between James Whitmore and Dr. Harrison Mills, a physician who specialized in female nervous disorders. Sarah photographed each document with her phone, her anger growing as she read Dr. Mills's recommendations: complete isolation from social stimulation, limited intellectual activities to prevent overstimulation, and most disturbingly, restraint during episodes of emotional distress. But it was Eleanor's own words that truly broke Sarah's heart. Hidden among the official correspondence was a collection of letters Eleanor had written to her sister in Boston, letters that had apparently never been sent. Dearest Catherine, one letter began, dated just 2 weeks before Margaret's wedding. I watch the gardeners preparing the grounds below my window for what promises to be a magnificent celebration. How I long to wear a beautiful dress again, to feel the sun on my face, to dance with my husband as I once did. But James says I am not well enough, that the excitement would surely cause another episode. Sarah paused in her reading, glancing up at the small basement window where afternoon light was beginning to fade. Eleanor's handwriting was beautiful, her thoughts articulate and rational. There was no evidence of mental instability in these letters, only profound sadness and isolation. Another letter, dated the day after the wedding, was even more poignant. The celebration was everything I imagined it would be. I could hear the orchestra playing, could see the ladies in their gorgeous gowns. Margaret looked radiant in her ivory lace. I pressed my face to the window, hoping someone might notice me, might remember that I too was once part of this family. But I remained invisible, as I always am now. Sarah wiped away a tear, then continued photographing the documents. She'd found what appeared to be Eleanor's medical records, and they painted a disturbing picture of a woman whose grief had been pathologized and whose attempts at recovery had been systematically undermined. Dr. Mills's notes described Eleanor as prone to melancholia and hysteria, but his treatment recommendations seemed designed more to keep her hidden than to help her heal. Sarah made a note to research Dr. Mill's background and credentials. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. "Any progress?" "I've been thinking about Eleanor all week," Sarah replied. "Significant progress. Eleanor's story is heartbreaking but important. Would you be willing to meet tomorrow?" The response came quickly. "Yes. I think it's time the family knew the truth." Sarah met Dorothy at a quiet cafe in downtown Newport, her laptop bag heavy with photocopied documents and research. The autumn wind rattled the windows as she spread Eleanor's letters and medical records across their corner table. "I need to warn you," Sarah began carefully. "What I've discovered about Eleanor's treatment is quite disturbing by today's standards." Dorothy nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. The family has always been vague about exactly what happened to her." Sarah opened her laptop and showed Dorothy the digital copies of Dr. Mills's treatment notes. Eleanor wasn't suffering from a mental illness in the way we understand it today. Her symptoms, depression, withdrawal, occasional emotional outbursts, were classic signs of complicated grief following the loss of her child. She pulled up additional research she'd conducted. Dr. Harrison Mills was trained in what was then called moral treatment for women's nervous disorders, but his methods were largely experimental and often harmful. Dorothy read over the documents, her expression growing increasingly horrified. Chloral hydrate, prolonged bed rest, these sound like torture methods. They essentially were, Sarah confirmed. Eleanor was given sedatives daily, confined to her room for weeks at a time, and forbidden from engaging in activities she enjoyed. Reading, painting, even letter writing was restricted because it was considered overstimulating. As Sarah showed Dorothy one of Eleanor's hidden letters. "I have tried to convince James that I feel stronger when I am allowed to read or paint, but Dr. Mills insists that intellectual activity will worsen my condition. I spend my days staring out the window, watching the world continue without me." The tragedy, Sarah continued, is that Eleanor's own writings show she was completely lucid. She understood her situation, expressed her feelings clearly, and even demonstrated insight into her grief process. But because she was a woman in 1912 who had experienced loss, her normal emotional responses were pathologized. Dorothy was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the information. Finally, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "So when that photograph was taken, Eleanor was essentially a prisoner in her own home, forced to watch her family celebrate while she was drugged and isolated upstairs." "Exactly. And based on these medical records, she remained in that condition for years." Sarah hesitated before sharing the next piece of information. "Dorothy, I found Eleanor's death certificate. She died in 1919, at age 30, still confined to that third-floor room. The cause of death was listed as complications from nervous exhaustion, but given the medications she was receiving and her years of confinement," Dorothy closed her eyes. "She never recovered because she was never allowed to recover." "That's my assessment, yes. Eleanor was a victim of the medical attitudes of her time, but more than that, she was failed by a family who prioritized reputation over her well-being." Dorothy sat back in her chair, processing this revelation. "What do we do with this information now?" Dorothy returned home to the modest colonial house she'd inherited from her grandmother, Eleanor's story weighing heavily on her mind. That evening, she made a decision that would change everything. She called a family meeting. Within a week, 3 generations of Whitmores had gathered in Dorothy's living room. Her son, Michael, a lawyer from Boston, sat beside his teenage daughter, Emma. Dorothy's younger sister, Patricia, had driven up from New York with her adult children, David and Susan. "I asked you all here because we need to discuss something that's been hidden in our family for over a century," Dorothy began, placing the 1912 wedding photograph on the coffee table. The family members looked puzzled until Dorothy explained about Sarah's discovery and the subsequent research into Eleanor's story. She read portions of Eleanor's letters aloud, her voice breaking as she shared the young woman's desperate pleas for freedom and understanding. 16-year-old Emma was the first to speak. "Great-great-aunt Eleanor was basically imprisoned for having depression. That's horrible." Michael, ever the lawyer, was more measured in his response. "We have to remember mental health treatment was primitive in 1912. The family probably thought they were doing what was best. But they weren't," Patricia interjected firmly. "They were protecting their social standing at the expense of a young woman's life." David, who worked as a social worker, had been quietly reviewing the medical records Dorothy had shared. These treatment notes are genuinely disturbing. Eleanor was showing signs of recovery multiple times, but every time she seemed to improve, Dr. Mills increased her medications or further restricted her activities. Susan, an artist herself, was particularly moved by Eleanor's letters. "Listen to this," she said, reading from one of the documents. "Today, I managed to sketch the oak tree outside my window. For a few moments, I felt like myself again. But James found my drawings and Dr. Mills said creative expression was dangerous for my nervous system. They have taken away my pencils." The room fell silent. Finally, Dorothy spoke again. "Sarah Chen, the appraiser who discovered all this, asked me an important question. What do we do with this information now?" Emma looked up from the photograph, studying the barely visible figure in the window with new understanding. "We tell her story. We make sure people know what really happened to her." "But how?" Michael asked. "And why now, after all these years?" Dorothy had been thinking about this all week, because Eleanor deserves to be remembered as more than just a family shame. She was an intelligent, educated woman who suffered a terrible loss and was then victimized by the medical and social attitudes of her time. Patricia nodded slowly. "And because there might be other families with similar hidden stories. If we share Eleanor's experience, maybe it helps people understand how far we've come in treating mental health and how far we still need to go." David pulled out his phone. "I think we should document everything properly. Create a complete record of Eleanor's story, including the family's role in her treatment." Inspired by the family's decision to honor Eleanor's memory, Sarah expanded her research beyond the Newport Historical Society. She contacted genealogical societies, medical historians, and even reached out to other families who had lived in Newport's Mansion District during the early 1900s. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dr. Catherine Walsh, a psychiatrist and medical historian at Brown University, who specialized in the treatment of women's mental health in the early 20th century. Eleanor's case was unfortunately typical, Dr. Walsh explained during their phone interview. The period from 1900 to 1920 was particularly dangerous for women experiencing any form of emotional distress. The medical establishment had pathologized normal grief responses, especially in women who had lost children. Dr. Walsh had been researching Dr. Harrison Mills for her own academic work. Mills was actually considered progressive for his time because he advocated treating women at home rather than in asylums, but his methods were still based on the belief that women's minds were inherently fragile and needed to be protected from stimulation. Sarah arranged to meet Dr. Walsh at Brown University's medical library, where the professor had uncovered additional documentation about Eleanor's case. "This is quite remarkable," Dr. Walsh said, showing Sarah a medical journal from 1913. Dr. Mills actually wrote about Eleanor's case, though he didn't use her name, in an article about treating domestic melancholia. Sarah read the article with growing horror. Mills described Eleanor's case as a success story, praising his method of complete environmental control and graduated restriction of stimulating activities. He noted that his patient had ceased her emotional outbursts and resistant behaviors after 18 months of treatment. What he's describing as success, Dr. Walsh observed, is actually learned helplessness. Eleanor didn't recover, she gave up fighting. But Dr. Walsh had found something else that gave Sarah hope. A letter from Eleanor's sister Catherine in Boston, written to the Rhode Island Medical Society in 1918. "I am writing to express concern about the treatment my sister, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, has received under the care of Dr. Harrison Mills," the letter began. "During my recent visit, I found Eleanor to be lucid, articulate, and desperate for human contact. Her confinement appears to be causing more harm than healing." The letter went on to describe Catherine's observations. Eleanor was capable of rational conversation, showed no signs of violence or instability, and expressed coherent thoughts about her grief and isolation. "Did anything come of this letter?" Sarah asked. Dr. Walsh shook her head sadly. The Medical Society's response was to support Dr. Mills's judgment. They noted that family members were often too emotionally invested to properly assess a patient's condition. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising. So Eleanor's own sister couldn't advocate for her? Exactly. The system was designed to silence both the patient and anyone who might question the medical authorities' decisions. As Sarah prepared to leave, Dr. Walsh handed her one final document. "This might interest you. It's Dr. Mills' final report on Eleanor, written after her death in 1919. Sarah opened the file and gasped. Mills had noted that Eleanor's condition had stabilized completely in her final year, with no episodes of distress or resistance. But reading between the lines, Sarah realized what had actually happened. Eleanor had simply stopped trying to escape her confinement. Back in her office, Sarah made a discovery that would fundamentally change how she viewed Eleanor's story. While organizing the documents Dorothy had provided, she found something that had been overlooked: a small leather journal hidden behind the backing of the wedding photograph's frame. The journal, barely larger than Sarah's palm, contained Eleanor's private thoughts written in tiny, careful handwriting. Unlike the letters to her sister, these entries had never been intended for anyone else to read. June 15, 1912. Margaret's wedding was beautiful from my window. I have learned not to press my face against the glass where others might see me, but I watched every moment. When the orchestra played the wedding waltz, I danced alone in my room, remembering what it felt like to move to music. Sarah felt tears welling up as she continued reading. Far from the broken woman described in Dr. Mills's reports, Eleanor's private writings revealed someone who had found ways to maintain her sanity and dignity, despite her circumstances. July 3, 1912. I have discovered that if I am very quiet during Dr. Mills's visits and show no emotion, he reduces my medications. I have been pretending to be more sedated than I am, storing the pills under my mattress. My mind feels clearer now, though I must be careful not to let anyone see. Eleanor had been fighting back in the only way she could, through deception and small acts of resistance. She had taught herself to appear compliant while secretly working to preserve her mental faculties. September 10, 1912. I have been writing poetry in my memory, composing verses that I recite silently to myself. James burned my books, but he cannot burn the words I carry in my mind. Today I remembered every line of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. I'm still myself, no matter what they try to make me become. Page after page revealed Eleanor's incredible inner strength. She had created elaborate mental exercises to keep her mind sharp, had developed a system for observing the household routines and seasons through her window, and had maintained hope despite years of isolation. December 25, 1913. It has been nearly 3 years since I held my baby. I allow myself to remember him on Christmas, to speak his name aloud in my room. William. I was not allowed to attend his funeral, but I have created a memorial in my heart where he lives still. Sarah realized that Eleanor's story was not just about victimization. It was about resilience, intelligence, and the human spirit's refusal to be completely broken. The journal's final entries, from 1918, were particularly poignant. I have learned that survival sometimes requires others to believe you have surrendered. Dr. Mills thinks I am cured because I no longer resist his treatments. James believes I am content because I no longer ask to leave my room. But inside I am planning. When the right moment comes, I will find a way to tell my story. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the realization that Eleanor had been hoping, even at the end, that someone would someday understand what had really happened to her. Sarah knew she had to handle Eleanor's journal with extreme care. This wasn't just a historical document. It was evidence of a woman's secret resistance and a family's tragic failure. She called Dorothy immediately. I need you to come to my office, Sarah said. I've found Eleanor's own words, and they change everything. When Dorothy arrived an hour later, accompanied by her son Michael and granddaughter Emma, Sarah shared the journal's contents. The room was silent, except for the sound of pages turning and occasional gasps of recognition. She was pretending to be sicker than she was, Dorothy whispered after reading several entries. She was protecting herself the only way she could. Emma, who had been quietly reading over her grandmother's shoulder, looked up with tears in her eyes. She was so smart and so alone. Michael, approaching the situation with his legal background, was troubled by different implications. This journal suggests Eleanor was competent to make her own decisions for years before her death. If this had been presented to the court, her guardianship status might have been overturned. Sarah nodded. That's exactly right. Eleanor understood this too. Look at this entry from 1917. She pointed to a passage where Eleanor had written about observing legal procedures for other women in similar situations, noting that presentation of evidence of competency could lead to restoration of legal rights. I have been studying the law books James keeps in the library below. When Mary moves through the house to dust, I can sometimes hear her discussions with the cook about other families' troubles. Mrs. Henderson's daughter was recently released from similar confinement after her husband died and her brother advocated for her. I wonder if anyone would advocate for me. Dorothy looked stricken. Her own family should have advocated for her. But there's more, Sarah continued, turning to one of the journal's most revealing passages. I have hidden this journal and my poems in places where they might be found someday, when I am gone. Perhaps whoever discovers them will understand that I never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping, never stopped being Eleanor. Sarah looked around the room. She knew someone would find this eventually. She was documenting her own story for us. Emma spoke up, her teenage voice strong with conviction. Then we have to make sure her story gets told properly. She trusted that somebody would find this and understand. Michael was already thinking practically. We should contact that professor you mentioned, Dr. Walsh. This journal could be significant for medical history research. Dorothy held the small leather book carefully, as if it were a sacred object. Eleanor waited over a century for her voice to be heard. We're not going to let her wait any longer. Sarah felt a sense of purpose settling over the group. So what exactly do we want to do? Emma answered first. Everything. We tell her story, we correct the historical record, and we make sure people understand what really happened to women like Eleanor. Dorothy nodded slowly. Yes, Eleanor deserves to have her intelligence, her strength, and her humanity recognized. She wasn't a victim of mental illness. She was a victim of a system that refused to see women as fully human. Then we start immediately, Sarah said, already making plans in her mind. We document everything properly, we contact historians and journalists, and we create a memorial that honors Eleanor's memory accurately. Michael pulled out his phone. I'll start with legal research. We need to understand the full extent of what happened to Eleanor under the law. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the main gallery of the Newport Historical Society, watching visitors examine the exhibition she had helped create, Hidden Lives, Women's Mental Health in Gilded Age Newport. The centerpiece was Eleanor's wedding photograph, now properly contextualized with her journal entries, letters, and medical records. Dorothy had donated Eleanor's journal and all related family documents to create a permanent archive. Dr. Walsh had contributed her research on Dr. Mills and similar cases. Most importantly, Eleanor's own words were displayed prominently, allowing visitors to understand her experience in her own voice. The exhibition's opening had drawn national attention. Medical historians, women's rights advocates, and descendants of other Newport families had come to pay their respects to Eleanor and to learn from her story. Emma, now 17, had written the exhibition's introduction. Eleanor Whitmore was a victim of her time, but she was also a survivor who refused to let her spirit be broken. Her story reminds us that behind every historical injustice were real people who suffered, resisted, and hoped for better futures. Sarah watched as a young mother read Eleanor's poetry aloud to her daughter, explaining how Eleanor had kept these verses alive in her memory when all her books were taken away. An elderly man studied the medical records with a grim expression, then told Sarah that his own grandmother had been similarly confined in the 1920s. Dorothy approached, carrying a bouquet of white roses. The family has decided to place a memorial marker at Eleanor's grave, she said. We found out she was buried in an unmarked plot in the family cemetery. That's going to change. Dr. Walsh had been documenting other similar cases throughout New England, and Eleanor's story had become a catalyst for broader research into the treatment of women's mental health in the early 20th century. Eleanor's case is particularly powerful because we have her own words, Dr. Walsh had explained to reporters. She documented her own competency and resistance, leaving evidence that challenges the medical authorities' claims about her condition. Michael had successfully petitioned to have Eleanor's legal status posthumously reviewed. While largely symbolic, the court's acknowledgement that Eleanor had been wrongfully declared incompetent provided official recognition that she had been failed by the system that was supposed to protect her. As the day wound down, Sarah found herself alone with the wedding photograph. The figure in the window no longer seemed mysterious or ghostly. It was simply Eleanor, a young woman trying to participate in her family's life from behind a prison of medical prejudice and social stigma. Sarah thought about Eleanor's final journal entry. I believe that someday, people will understand that a woman's grief does not make her mad, that a mother's tears do not make her dangerous, that intelligence and emotion can coexist in the same person. When that day comes, perhaps my story will help other women avoid my fate. That day had finally come. Eleanor's voice, silent for over a century, was now being heard. Her story of resilience, intelligence, and hope had found its audience at last. The wedding photograph, once a symbol of hidden family shame, had become a powerful reminder of the importance of listening to women's voices, believing their experiences, and never underestimating the human capacity for survival and dignity, even in the darkest circumstances. Eleanor Whitmore had waited 111 years for justice. Finally, she had found it.